Thank you, Ciara, and everybody. I'm glad to be here tonight with you for this time together, this balm in Gilead, this oasis, this refuge in the time of deep crisis and struggle. I was poking around on the official Women's History Month website, which is maintained by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian. And, who knows whether the website will look the same tomorrow as it does today, but nevertheless, there is a collection on the website of photographs from the National Woman's Party. This party, founded in 1916, attracted publicity, organized protests, and put pressure on government officials in order to get Congress to pass an amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote. Now, there are almost 500 pictures in this collection of photographs. There are no Black women in any of the photos, not one. How can you create a Women of Protest, which is what it's called, photo collection, and exclude Black women? Well, we know how. We know that before the 19th Amendment was actually passed, Sojourner Truth, one of the ancestors we lifted up just moments ago, was asking the question, ain't I a woman? Pushing back against the white women whose fight for voting rights didn't include Black women. And we know that 40 years after the 19th Amendment was passed, Mother Fannie Lou Hamer, whose name we have also invoked today, was declaring that she had been tired for so long and she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. President Lyndon Johnson was afraid of the power of Fannie Lou's live testimony before the Democratic National Convention in the summer of 1964, so scared of her truth-telling that he called an emergency press conference at the White House to divert media coverage away from Mother Hamer's remarks. Just like Fannie Lou and Sojourner's names probably don't get called when this country is reflecting about the contributions of women. The name of the woman mentioned in the biblical passage that was just read is probably not familiar to most. It wasn't familiar to me for a long time. But her witness here in these verses in 2 Samuel ought to encourage us to fight on, because we are standing on the shoulders of women freedom fighters like Rispa. Say her name, whisper her name to yourself, Rispa. Now, in order to understand Rispa's story, you got to go back to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua, we read that the children of biblical Israel were moving into the land of Canaan. They had escaped the bondage of Egyptian slavery. They'd wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, murmuring and complaining and longing for the familiar security of enslavement. Moses dies. And Joshua helps the people break the curse of internalized oppression so they can make this pilgrim into the so-called promised land. But we know that the promised land was not vacant. In order for the Israelites to settle in Canaan, they had to drive out the nations already occupying the land. So Israel put together a great army, and with Joshua as their leader, they took over. And the text records them winning battle after battle. And if they lost a fight, they prayed, went back, and won the rematch. The text says, at the vibrations of their marching feet and their loud trumpets, even the walls of Jericho, indestructible, came tumbling down. So word on the street was that surely the hand of God was upon the Israelites, because all they did was win. The nation of Gibeon mentioned in today's text, knew that Israel was getting close. They knew they were next on the list, and they didn't have a mighty army like the Israelites. They didn't have fortress walls like Jericho. Rather than face a mass genocide, rather than face utter humiliation, they decided to throw up the flag of surrender. They decided to turn down the invitation to war. And so, because they surrendered, Joshua made a covenant with the Gibeonites. He said, "We will never destroy you." This covenant lasted for generations until Saul, good old Saul, became the king of biblical Israel. And Saul was no diplomat. His first concern was enlarging his territory, securing his empire. That sounds familiar to me. Does it sound familiar to you? In his zeal for conquest, Saul gave the order, destroy the Gibeonites. Saul broke the covenant that Joshua had made to that nation. He attacked and killed them to steal their land and amass power. Saul's ego trip and violence jeopardized biblical Israel's political relationships, and Saul died before he could make amends for the mess he had made. And now here we are in 2 Samuel. We see that Israel has been in a famine for 3 years, and King David is trying to figure out why. He prays, and God says, well, the famine is due to Saul's bloodthirsty ways. Saul violated the promise, and now his nation is suffering. Now, we know David. David is no stranger to political wheeling and dealing, so he comes up with a plan. He goes to the Gibeonites and he says, I want to make amends for what Saul did. The Gibeonites, they reject any offer of Saul's silver or gold. I'm sure they said, how dare you offer us remnants of our murderer's possessions? How dare you pass his legacy down to us? And the Gibeonites, they also reject any eye for eye offer. You kill some Israelites to make up for the death of our folk. No. But eventually they do agree on this arrangement. The Gibeonites ask David to kill 7 of Saul's sons. So David agrees to this plan. David chooses 5 of Saul's grandsons and 2 of Saul's sons. And the 2 sons, they were Rizpah's boys. The 7 men were hanged, left on the mountainside in view of everyone. Reminds me of Mike Brown's body lying on Canfield Drive for more than 4 hours 11 years ago. It was the custom to bury those who were killed in this way after one day. But David left those bodies there to rot, to decompose in the hot sun. And Rizpah, this mama, had had enough. Like Fannie Lou, like Sojourner, she had been tired for too long. Now, she didn't have much political agency. She was one of Saul's many wives, probably dismissed and discarded on a regular basis. But now here she was, left to fend for herself after her sons were killed. She was denied the right to protect her boys, to bury her boys with respect and love. Rizpah was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Her sons and the sons of other mothers were the surrogates in the atonement game that David played with the Gibeonites. Her sons and the sons of other mothers were pawns in their politicking. They were killed to pay somebody else's debt. They were killed because they had the wrong ancestral lineage. They were killed because they reminded David and the Gibeonite people of the legacy of Saul's oppressive regime. Killed because they threatened the government's success. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Killed to pay a debt to an old enemy. Killed. God had told David that the famine was due to broken promises and bloodthirst. And David responds, instead of confessing his sins, instead of repenting of Saul's sins, instead of seeking to rule and reign in a different way without violence, without broken promises, David decides that the lives of these 7 men are disposable. But Rizpah had had enough. Rizpah may have not had much in terms of social status, but she did have the power of a rebellious faith. Rizpah didn't have a law degree to fight the killing of her sons in court, but she did have a sackcloth and some ashes to make her grieving case in the court of public opinion. She had the tool of public grief. She refused to accept what had happened to her sons and these other mothers' sons, so she stayed in mourning. There was no moving on from this. She didn't have firearms or ammunition, but she had the tree branches around the mountain available to beat back the animals that wanted to devour their precious bodies. She had this tool of public protest. She wasn't going to let anything get in the way of her witness and her testimony. She didn't have a crowd of followers on social media, and she didn't make the rounds on the news station so she could tell her story, but she sat by herself for 5 months, y'all. From harvest season to the rainy season, praying and fasting and drawing attention to the assassination of her sons and those other mothers' sons. She had the tool of persistence in public. Nobody came to relieve her, give her a break from her shift so she could go get something to eat. Nobody brought her covered dishes to help her keep from starving, but she would not leave until she got what she came for, until David took responsibility, until her sons and the sons of those other mothers were buried with dignity and respect. Rebellious faith. She wouldn't let the 7 be forgotten. This was the first Say Their Name campaign. She risked herself for other mothers' sons. She sat there. She is the ancient ancestor to the mothers of the movement. And so David really had no choice. Government has to tremble and fall under the weight of righteous truth. That's the good news. Rizpah's protest, Rizpah's grief, Rizpah's persistence drove the king to take those 7 bodies down from the mountain and bury them properly. We are mobilizing. We are organizing, we are lamenting as Freedom Church of the Poor, as dissident disciples of God in flesh, because we are witnessing and have for a long time witnessed bloodthirsty regimes in living technicolor. We see our own nation pledging itself to an unholy marriage of convenience and profits and power with the government of the modern day state of Israel, subsidizing the very disposal of human beings made by God's hand and in God's image. We see the United States politicians making deals that are going to cost our most vulnerable folk everything and eventually cost everybody everything. We see them just the other day, right before hurricane season begins, holding disaster aid hostage unless cities and towns and states pledge their loyalty to Israel. Cruelty is the point. The text seemed to suggest that because David relented, that's how the famine ended. But I want to take a womanist reading of this passage. God restored the land and brought the rain to end the famine because Rizpah had kept vigil over those bodies for 5 long months. It wasn't an act of Congress. It wasn't an executive order. It was a grieving mother who had the nerve to embarrass the state, to shame the state into doing right by her boys. And it was her rebellion, Rizpah's rebellion, that brought God's intervention, yielding the clouds to rain. So I just want to know tonight, do you have Rizpah's rebellious faith? Will you sit in public lamentation until justice is served? When we do, these unjust leaders will tremble where they stand, and they will have no choice but to respond. They may try to ignore us like David did for 5 long months. They may try to silence us like Lyndon B. Johnson tried to preempt and cut off Fannie Lou Hamer. But ultimately, God's justice will prevail. We will be vindicated for telling the truth and shaming the devil. So is there anybody here who has a Rizpah spirit today? Anybody who refuses to live into the kind of piety, the kind of faith, the kind of holiness that requires some people to die so that others can live? Do you have the Rizpah spirit to refuse to shut up, to refuse to go away until we get what we demand? Until Black people everywhere are fully and finally free. Until Palestine is fully and finally free. Is there one willing to start a Rizpah rebellion today? Thanks be to God. Amen.